And I'm with World Trade Center, Utah. And we'd like to extend a thank you to Utah Valley University and to the Herbert Institute of Public Policy and to Strider for making everything today possible. And this afternoon's panel, we will be talking about trade winds and viable alternatives to China. And I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today, who is Alison Szalwinski. And Alison is the Vice President of Research at the National Bureau for Asian Research, and she will lead our discussion today. Please join me in welcoming Alison and our panelists.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We have the dubious honor to be the last panel here today. So hopefully we'll keep things lively for you and engaging as we have a great panel of speakers here for you today. So first, let me thank the World Trade Center Utah and Utah Valley University and Strider for convening us all here today. I will give a few just kind of preliminary setting the stage remarks before asking a few questions of our panelists here. And before they begin speaking, I'll ask them to do a self-introduction and kind of give the audience an idea of your background. So just to kind of kick things off, we'll be talking today about China's integration into the international trading system and how this has impacted regional and global trade relations. In recent years, U.S. China trade tensions have really been at the forefront of the conversation. But there are many other China-related challenges that have arisen as well, leading to the emergence of new strategic thinking toward trade policy in the US and in like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Supply chain disruptions throughout the COVID-19 pandemic have heightened pre-existing concerns about overdependence on China as the dominant source for critical goods, elevating the role of supply chains for supply chain resiliency in national security. And we've seen some similar themes recently play out in real time in the challenges that Europe has faced due to its dependence on Russian energy in the face of Russian invasion in Ukraine. Meanwhile, increasing digitalization and the rise of the digital economy are changing the very nature of trade. While smart technology and increased connectivity are similarly redefining the logistics networks upon which global trade operates. As debate has sparked over how best to govern the data flows necessary to facilitate these changes, so has discussion about China's role and ambitions to influence these data flows and lock in its central position in global trade. So, as we explored a bit this morning in some of the morning sessions, China's integration into the international trading system has occurred at an incredibly rapid pace in the 40-plus years since Deng Xiaoping launched the reform and opening period. Much of this astonishing growth across this period has been facilitated by its integration into the global economy. China's opening benefited from really fortunate timing, as it coincided with a dramatic increase in global trade and globalization of supply chains, especially for manufactured goods. This integration into the burgeoning global trade system allowed for the large-scale capital investment and corresponding productivity increases that enabled China's rise to its current position as a manufacturing powerhouse. As China has integrated into the global economy, it has nevertheless flaunted some of the key rules and norms of the pre-existing liberal economic order that helped to facilitate its rise. Private firms received non-market benefits, intellectual property protections were almost non-existent, and foreign firms seeking to operate in China were forced into joint ventures, which often included forced tech transfer. And state-owned firms retained a critical role in the economy, benefiting from direct subsidies and other state support. Despite this, there was widespread optimism that integration into the global economy would turn China into a responsible stakeholder and a pillar of the liberal economic order. As such, in 2001, the PRC was admitted to the WTO, giving it access to lower MFN tariff rates across developed and developing countries alike. The skyrocketing volumes of Chinese exports that followed both improved living standards in China and importing countries, and also had some disrupting effects that perhaps we'll get into a little bit more on this panel. However, China, while reaping the benefits of WTO membership, again, has flaunted some of the commitments that it made to secure this membership. Beijing continued to use state subsidies and IP theft, including forced tech transfer, as capital, talent, and industrial capacity flooded into China. Over time, these efforts became increasingly strategic, with the CCP using these tools to dominate global supply chains in industries it deemed critical to national interests. And in recent years, China has taken some additional steps to realize its own vision and preferences for regional and global trade from the points of tension in the U.S. China trade relationship, and where do things currently stand as we see a trade relationship. So CJ first, and if you can do a quick self-introduction.
Sure. I'm CJ Mahoney. I'm a Deputy General Counsel of Microsoft, where I advise the company on international trade and national security issues. Before joining the company last year, I was the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative and worked mostly on the renegotiation of NAFTA, USMCA, but also was involved in China, UK, Kenya, and other negotiations that were going on at that time. I'd also just like to echo the thanks to the conference organizers. I really think this has been a fantastic event, and I'm really honored to have been invited. When you think about the points of tension in the trade relationship, I really kind of think of them in two categories. I mean, one are just all of the micro issues. And when I was at USTR, we came up with a huge list of dozens of trade irritants that have been identified. If you look at the National Trade Estimate, which is a report that USTR puts out every year, it goes on for page after page after page on issues like ractopamine in pork products, and in addition to forced technology transfer and subsidies and some of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking about at this conference. But I think it is a mistake to think about it just at a micro level and think, if we just had a technical solution to each one of these problems, the relationship would be perfect. I think the reality is that the relationship has just become much more complicated because, for many years, it wasn't as if there was no there were no points of tension in the overall U.S.-China relationship. I mean, if you look back to the Clinton administration, we mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. I mean, it was a terrible moment that inflamed tensions. During the George W. Bush administration, there was the Hainan Island incident, but at the time, for many years, I think there was a view among policymakers and I think, frankly, also among businesses that the different aspects of the relationship could be compartmentalized. That there was the security relationship, maybe security rivalry. There was a dialogue on human rights, and then there was the kind of the economic technology trade relationship. And there was a view that you could kind of keep all of those things separate. So if you had tensions on human rights, as there have been on Tibet and other issues over the years, the thought was you didn't have those conversations in connection with the economic conversation, and the security conversation was completely different. Well, I think the biggest change, and really sort of the biggest source of long-term tension, is that now, as we've entered a new phase in the overall relationship, I think all of these issues are combined. I mean, we've seen that play out in public policy in a number of ways. A lot of the export controls that were implemented starting in the Trump administration, but have been built upon in the Biden administration, really sort of go at the nexus of economic and national security issues. Congress passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which imposes a pretty dramatic new regime on forced labor enforcement, which takes a trade tool and applies it to an area of human rights. And so I think for policymakers and for businesses that do business both in the United States and China, it's just become a much more complicated puzzle, and all of those issues will be in play, and that's just the sources of tension have just multiplied.
Thanks, that's great. All right, we'll turn next to Jonathan. Quick self-introduction.
Sure. Jonathan Bench. I'm an international business attorney based here in Salt Lake City. I spent 3 years in China pre-law school. I was in Hong Kong for 2 years and then mainland China. So I'm very deeply invested in Hong Kong, and also I have several hundred former students that I taught when I was in China. So I'm I'm invested from a personal aspect, but I'm also invested because I spent the last 20 years of my life learning Cantonese, learning Mandarin, and devoting my time to that, to understanding the nuances of the language and how that fits into the greater business context. So I love China. I love that we're here talking about this. I love that UVU is hosting us. I'm so glad that my panelists came from the far-flung coast to be here with us and bring their expertise. So tension. So in my practice, I represent a lot of small and medium-sized companies. I represent both Chinese companies coming to the States, and I represent U.S. companies engaging in China with some way. And these are not, that's why I'm glad we have the bigger guns here on this side to talk about what the issues are from big company perspectives. My bread and butter is the small and medium-sized companies that when they see Section 301 tariff list come out, they look and see, and they think this is going to kill my business, right? This is going to obliterate everything I've got. And I'm not big enough to retool my supply chain to go to somewhere else, right? I can't go from China to Vietnam. I can't go from China to Philippines or Indonesia or Africa. I can't go to Mexico. I don't have the infrastructure, right? China has made it so easy, right? We have assisted, but China has made it so easy to have a plug-and-play relationship as a U.S. company, and so that's very difficult to navigate. And so I'll talk a little bit later, I think one of the other questions about what happens when you finally get to the point as a business owner, you realize, I can't stay in China 100%. Yeah. What do I do now? How do I retool? How do I reevaluate my business relationships? And did I lay the groundwork 5 or 10 years ago to be able to pull out in a nice way? Is it going to be bad? What's going to happen next? And so the PR issues will still be real, not as big as if you were a multinational company, but still very real issues to consider when you are thinking about retooling your whole supply chain. From the China side, the CFIUS, that's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS has presented some very real challenges for what I consider law-abiding, good Chinese companies that just want to come and do business in the States. And of course, I'm not privy to what my Chinese clients are doing behind closed doors or what the conversations they may be having. So I have to take them at face value when they tell me they're abiding by the law. But that means that when I'm looking at them investing, I actually have a company I'm representing right now that is trying to develop a microchip company. They have the technology in China. They want to bring it to the States. And the first question they ask me is, will CFIUS kill this deal? What's going to happen? And so they get me involved early because I can look and see, is this the kind of technology, is this the kind of scenario where they're likely to get the plug pulled on this deal now, or 10 years from now when trade tensions change, because under CFIUS there is no statute of limitations, which means there's no safe harbor unless you go through the CFIUS process. So there are considerations for companies, and I would say there's no easy answers. It gives me job security, but it also gives me a little bit of anxiety because they want me to give them the answer, and I say I can get you this far. The rest of it, we got to walk in the dark together.
Great. And Sarah, round us out.
Sure. So Sarah Kemp, I'm currently at Intel, although I'm newish to Intel. This is month 4. Before that, I was in the pharmaceutical industry with Merck, and before that, I was in the U.S. government. From 2000 to 2017, I was in Asia, 3 tours in Beijing, a tour in Vietnam, a tour in Hong Kong, and then I came back and I was the Deputy Undersecretary for International Trade at the Department of Commerce. So that's where my biases come from. I'll just lay that right there. I think my panelists have highlighted a lot of the tensions, right? I'm just going to pick one that I think particularly for big companies we're feeling acutely, and that is that U.S.-China relations are not just an international issue anymore. It's not an international relation. It's a domestic policy and a domestic politic relation on both sides, meaning Xi Jinping is playing to his domestic audience, and the government here has to play to its domestic audience. And oftentimes that leaves U.S. companies in the middle, walking a tightrope. And it's challenging to try to figure out how to walk a tightrope and be an honest partner to both. Because first and foremost, particularly as a big company, we abide by all the rules and regulations, export controls, everything of both countries, right? Because we want to be that, as I think Ambassador Huntsman said, U.S. companies bring standards, bring a way of doing business, and we're not going to lessen our risk analysis. We're not going to lessen the way we do business. But it is getting increasingly more difficult as it becomes more of a domestic political debate on both sides. So that's one. I would also say, you know, the rules of the road for technology. That's what's being played out for a big company like Intel. When you look at China, you know, made in China 2030. The lovely thing about China is they're not shy to tell you what they want to do. It's in black and white, right?
Yep.
Right? It's on you. It's in the 5-year plan. And they've got KPIs. I mean, I love the Chinese because they've got the KPIs. Like, hey, we want to own chip to cloud. We want 70% of the world market by 2030. There you go, right? So it's clear. But that's challenging, right? It's the biggest market. It's a growing market. But how do you play in that, right? That can get challenging, particularly when you talk about the micro side. It is also, besides the great work that CJ did in terms of like the macro, when you get down to doing business in China, it's not the rules, it's the practice, right? It's how things are done in terms of the review process, for example. It's following the letter of the law, but how is it done? What information do you have to give up? Where do you think that information may or may not end up? Does it end up helping a competitor or a soon-to-be built competitor with the Chinese government? There's lots of different interesting ins and outs that you really have to pay attention to. And then I guess the last thing, in just terms of tension points, current tension points, the only thing I will add is, you know, the Russian-Ukraine war, I think, is interesting in that I think when you look at what Russia is saying, right, they're saying technological sovereignty. They're talking about islandization. Yeah, it's a thing. It was translated from Russian. I don't know. I should ask actually you to look at it. Yeah,
Sure.
and then relocalization, right? Those are the things that Russia is talking about its IT sector and what it's doing as a result of the sanctions that it's experienced. I think China is looking at all that and say, the U.S. and its allies in Europe, the Western world, acted really quickly, really, really quickly, like lightning speed. I think they were shocked. B, what does it mean? What are the playbooks that I have to look at if it ever is turned against China, right? And so that adds an interesting new, I would say, layer to the complexity that exists. So I'll just stop there.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we can dive a little bit more into maybe how that's shaping some of the other conversations about decoupling in terms of what China then decides to do if it wants to avoid a Russia-esque situation in the later term. So we'll put a pin in that, come back to decoupling in a few minutes. But I wanted to turn back to CJ for a second and maybe draw on some of your policy experience, some of your time at USTR, to ask how has U.S. policy shifted to address rising and more economically powerful China? And you know, what is going on right now? What is the current USTR trade policy, some of the key initiatives to watch towards China?
Well, I think it's important to kind of, you know, go back to and understand the, you know, the full context of how we got to this point. Because the reality is that over the last, you know, really at this point, 25 years, the U.S. government has tried several different strategies to deal with the rise of China. The first and most significant was the decision of the Clinton administration to support China as a accession to the WTO. And, you know, whatever, you know, one thinks about the results of that, you know, there was a rational thought process that led to that. The idea was that China is opening up to the world. It's a huge country. It's a huge economy. We will, you know, and President Clinton at the time, you know, made the argument that, listen, we're not really giving up anything. We're just promising to give China our most favored nation tariffs. China's, at the same time, China's going to lower a lot of market access barriers. So they're basically making all the concessions. We're making none of the concessions. The flaw in that, though, was that the concession that we made, though, was that we were going to deal with trade relationships, trade tensions with China within the context of the WTO and the WTO dispute resolution process, rather than having, at least keeping the option of dealing with it unilaterally. Before China was let into the WTO, there was an annual vote on PNTR. It passed every year, but there was always a certain amount of drama, and that gave the U.S. some leverage. We gave up that leverage in exchange for the market opening concessions that China agreed to make, many of which they did. And I think it's unfair to say that they didn't do anything. The problem is that the rules that we wrote in the WTO really were not meant. They were basically, and ultimately we assumed that these were rules that would work for countries like us and countries that would evolve to be like us. But we assumed that there was going to sort of be that natural evolution. And so the tensions, I think, started coming up in the Bush administration, where the U.S. at that point has a policy of having a number of high-level dialogues that took place, usually led by the Secretary of the Treasury, and we sued China in the WTO using the dispute resolution mechanism that China had agreed to. But what we found there was that the dispute resolution mechanism was really cumbersome. And I'm a trial litigator, and I sort of think of these things in terms of litigation, and it's just a very defendant-friendly forum. Because you don't have like you have in the United States, you don't have an injunctive process to where if there's an issue, you can get immediate relief. You have this just long drawn-out process that can take years. And then when you get to the end, you have a proceeding over whether the country that lost the case has complied with the ruling or not. That sets off a whole another multi-stage process. And in the end, the only remedy that you have is are trade sanctions. And sometimes by the time you get to the end of this process, the U.S. just finished a case with the EU that we just settled, and that took something like 15 years. Sometimes we would file these cases against China, and the industry that we were trying to protect was basically gone by the time the case was over with. So that really didn't work. The high-level dialogues, there were agreements that were made, but the issues persisted, and basically you had multiple secretaries of the Treasury, different dialogues, slightly different acronyms, but kind of the same conversation. In the Obama administration, with the pivot to Asia, was a different strategy, and that strategy, which the original idea behind TPP was that we would create this, basically this really attractive carrot in TPP, and use that as leverage to get China to make additional reforms. It was really, if you think about it, it was really kind of an update to the original WTO strategy, which is that we'll create something and we will use that in the price of entry into this. Into this market is going to be something that will encourage reform. And then when TPP and a lot of people don't remember that there were actually both major presidential candidates in the 2016 election opposed TPP, not just Donald Trump. My view is that TPP was dead in Congress long before Donald Trump formally announced the time of death. But regardless, there was a change in strategy then in the Trump administration, which focused on unilateral action, which started with the Section 301 report, and then the actions that came out of that, which weren't just tariffs but also export controls and investment restrictions. What we've seen now in the Biden administration is essentially maintenance of those key tenets of the Trump strategy, but supplementing it with domestic investments in infrastructure, R&D, and the CHIPS Act, which I hope we can get over the finish line. So I think it's not as if we haven't tried just about everything that I can think of to try. So what has led us to this point, I think, is not just it's not just it wasn't just one administration being trigger happy. It was a long series of different policy initiatives that were not producing the results that the United States wanted.
And so USTR now in the Biden administration has kind of some decision points to be made. Administration has been looking at the existing tariffs and some decisions pending there. And then there's also other conversations happening about how to potentially move forward and in certain aspects of both the U.S.-China trade relationship and then other trade throughout the region. So anything you would touch on the kind of forward-looking aspects?
Sure. I'll just say, I think there are kind of a few different things. There's the tariff piece, and it's been there's been a lot of discussion in this administration about what to do with the tariffs. I think I mean, I don't, I'm not involved in those conversations. The latest thing that Secretary Yellen said in testimony earlier this week is that they're looking at a reconfiguration of the tariffs, which actually even for her is a change from where she had been previously, where she had said she kind of thought that the whole tariff scheme was something that wasn't strategic, and indicated her willingness to do away with the whole thing. So I mean, if I were predicting, I would suggest I would anticipate that there will be some tweaks, but not a wholesale reduction or elimination of the tariffs. I think it's also kind of interesting that there was an attempt to try to use the framework of the Phase 1 deal to enter into new trade discussions with China. That was what Ambassador Tai, that was really kind of the first thing that she recommended, was that and within the Phase 1 agreement, and we talk more about this. I think one of the there was a dispute resolution process that for a time, before COVID and before other tensions in the relationship escalated, where when I was at USTR, there actually was a lot of good work that was being done in a very low-key way with senior officials, but in private, where the U.S. raised issues, the Chinese responded, and on a lot of the parts of the Phase 1 deal, like for example, the commitments that they made on intellectual property, they passed laws that, for the most part, complied with the agreement, and that was the result of. And there was give and take. There was, drafts were shared with USTR. USTR commented on them, and there was, there's maybe an alternative history where if you hadn't had, COVID and some of the other things that had happened in the last few years, that maybe that, that structure could have been one that could have been built upon. Unfortunately, at least from press reports, the efforts of USTR to kind of restart those conversations in the Biden administration really didn't get very far. So as far as I can tell now, there's really not any, high-level trade dialogue, and the focus has really turned to, unilaterally, what's the U.S. going to do to reconfigure tariffs, domestic investments, and then working with partners and allies in through IPEF and the Trade and Technology Council and those kinds of things. But it's the ambitions for direct trade negotiations with China at this point seem pretty low.
Great. All right, I'm going to jump around a little bit and ask Sarah a question. Get a little bit, tap into your industry, an industry as an example, or kind of ask a question about what we might learn from the semiconductor industry. So semiconductor industry has been one of the highest profile examples of how supply chain risks can really percolate throughout the whole economy. What lessons do you think policymakers should learn from the turbulence of such a critical industry, what has gone through over the past 2 years?
That's a great question, and I'll let my colleagues on the panel jump in if they want as well. It is true. Semiconductors are now front and center in a way they've never been. It's also true, semiconductors are also part of the reason you can't get cars. Housing starts are down, right? Because you don't have the chip that goes into the control for the thermostat for the new housing starts. So how do you have a secure supply chain? That is a conversation that is on every government's agenda around the world. And CJ, I don't know if you want to talk about what the administration has been doing to try to shore that up. There's been reports that have been done. Certainly Commerce has put out a report that has identified for semiconductors and in general what are the failed points, right? How do you do this? So I think governments are looking at how to regionalize at a minimum, right? They're looking at how do you attract and how do you develop a supply chain if it's not just your country, because some countries are not going to be able to have a supply chain solely in their country. How do you do it regionally? I think the Biden administration and some of their Latin American efforts are trying to do that. And I think that's what's needed. I think the challenge is going to be, we all want redundancy, right? So just-in-time supply chain, great until there's the pandemic, right? It's great until it doesn't work. So okay, if we all accept in the room that just-in-time supply chains are now not what we want more redundancy. Okay, that's great. Now we got to pay for it, right? That's a cost. And Boston Consulting Group said that it would require $1 trillion of incremental upfront investments to be able to do regional supply chain, right? If you're going to do a regional supply chain, that would increase the price of a semiconductor 35%, or as high as 65%, because there's not just one chip. There's lots of different. I'm learning this now. There's lots of different types of chips, different prices. So, but that requires an investment. Again, Intel is doubling down on its investment, but it's going to take everybody. It's going to take governments. It's going to take companies. It's going to take re-looking at our supply chains. So that's one of the things, is I think we have to look at supply chains differently. I think governments have to try to figure this out in terms of what are they willing to assist in, how are they going to do industrial policy, whether they call it industrial policy or call it something else. You know, as Ambassador Huntsman said, every 100 years you got to kind of step back and look at what's going on and reset for the economies that's coming in the future. So I think we need to do that. And then my advice on a company level is, you know, you have to re-look at your supply chains, right? Look at risk. What's the risk in your supply chain? Do you have any single source parts of it, right? What is a reasonable amount of inventory? I sit on a board of a company, and we have dramatically changed what our inventory levels are, dramatically, because of this. Whereas before, we're like, no, get it down, we don't want all that inventory, it's bad, they're not gonna like it. Now we're like, no, that's actually a good thing, right? And diversification of this supply base, I don't know if we're gonna talk about going to other geos, but you know, how do you diversify geographically? And then also, how do you increase standardization or sort of general parts in your supply chain? Like, is there something you can re-engineer or redo that takes complexity out? So I think those are some of the things.
Great, and that is a really great segue to turn to Jonathan now to ask a little bit about reshoring or nearshoring. So is it feasible for companies, maybe some of those that you work with or others that you kind of see out in the wild? And what are some of the best alternatives to China for sourcing and manufacturing if it's going to be or nearshoring?
So there are two parts to this. One is, how can you exit China gracefully if you need to exit, even if it's a partial exit? And then how do you identify new potential places to go? And I'll tell you, it's expensive, right? That's bottom line number one, is that retooling your supply chain, even in part, is going to be expensive. And so whatever your budget is for this, you probably need to double it. That's kind of par for the course. When you're looking at exiting China, depending on how you're involved, the first thing you have to do is go back and dust off your contracts, if you even have them, and see what you agreed to initially, right? It's how we, as Sarah and I were joking before this, when you're going into a new market, when you're going into a new relationship, you need your prenup at the same time as you have your marriage contract, right? You have to. Now, the clever lawyers put this into the same contract, so it's not that identifiable. It's not like, hi, will you marry me, and this is how we break up when we want to break up, right? It's better if you can wrap it all into the same agreement, and because you want to set the tone right, whether you're going into China, whether you're going into other markets. And so the savvy business people know that this all has to be part of the planning initially, right? You have to assume going in, whatever your relationship is, that at some point the relationship will change. Those dynamics will change in some way, hopefully for the better. Often something happens and it's worse. And this is the same in partnerships. I have husband and wives who I counsel, and they're going to business together. I have best friends, right? Same thing. It doesn't matter if your Chinese counterpart invited you to their child's wedding, right? You will have tension in the relationship. And so preparing that initially for an exit at some point is the right way to do it. And I'll give you a little bit more hope, because the Chinese legal system is getting better all the time, right? Their intellectual property, their respect for intellectual property rights is important, because now that they've stolen IP from us, they realize that they need to be able to protect it from everyone else, right? Right? I mean, that's what you do. So being able to protect, so if you as a foreign company, you're going into China for the first time, you need to register the IP first, right? Before you set one toe, before you pass one business card across the border, you need to register the IP, because that allows you to largely control it. And it's better. It's much better than it was 20 years ago, better than it was 10 or 5 years ago. And so if you're wondering, I have a contract from 10 years ago, is it going to be enforceable in China? The answer is most likely yes. Right? If it's tooled so you can go to a Chinese court, you go to a Chinese court in your counterparty's hometown, if they've stolen your molds, if you're trying to get your molds back, if you're just trying to get some inventory back because you're trying to retool, you're trying to get your molds, your tooling, any of that back, there are ways, certainly through the Chinese legal system, that you can do that. So that's a point of hope. Now on to the other part of the question, which is what do we do when we're looking around to go as an alternative to China, right? There is no perfect alternative to China right now, and based on population size, there are only a few potential leaders, and it's going to take us 20 years to get there, right? So I'm thinking about, India is a very easy alternative because we have the language affinity, we have the population base, we have a young population, and so we have the workers, so depending on what you're doing, I mean, this is the typical lawyer answer, right? Is everything depends on your facts and circumstances. So whether you're a U.S. company who is just manufacturing in China, simple things, plush toys, maybe you're doing cell phone components, maybe you're doing aviation components, right? Whatever you're doing there. Or maybe, on the flip side, you're looking at China as a market, and that's a good thing. That was the panel last hour, but I'll tell you that there are a lot of good U.S. companies that are still very much involved in going to China. They see China as the opportunity market, and they're not backing away from it. Now, Africa so this is my personal gospel, okay? India next, Africa after that, okay? Philippines is along for the ride. I'm glad that we have President here. I have a lot of love for the Filipinos in my heart because I was in Hong Kong and I spent a lot of time with Filipinos. So I have a lot, pharmaceutical industry in the Philippines. You have medical devices in Malaysia. So depending on what you're getting into and what you need in terms of infrastructure, these countries, everyone in Southeast Asia recognizes, and Central America as well, and Africa, they recognize that the U.S. and the West is not happy with the way things are going in China, and they're trying to tool up their infrastructure as fast as possible to receive us with open arms. I was in Mexico City and Guadalajara a month ago with Governor Cox and a trade delegation, and Mexico would like to be ready, but their government is not ready. It's going to take Mexico a few more years at the earliest to be able to start accepting clients the way that we can go to sourcing companies in China and have them do the turnkey operation for us. So it's going to take time, but this is the right conversation to have, and thinking about whether you're exiting China entirely, whether you're trying to diversify your supply chain risk. There are partners, lean on me, come get my card. I'm constantly trying to forecast out 10, 20 years. This is why I dusted off my high school Spanish, my 2 years of high school Spanish, about a year ago, because I decided, as I was getting inquiries from clients saying, I need to get out of China at least a little bit. I think I want to go to Mexico. What should I do? And Mexico, we have the USMCA, right, the new NAFTA treaty agreement. And so every Mexican business leader that I talked to last month said, USMCA. We're focused on the USMCA. We know there are benefits there. Our government is not keeping up with the obligations that we have under USMCA, but the business community is committed, and all we have to do is wait out AMLO until he's out. We'll vote in someone better, and we'll get the business environment online again. So the Mexican business environment is very focused on this. They're the gateway to the other Spanish-speaking countries in LATAM. So to the extent that you want treaty, you want proximity, you want cultural affinity, you want language affinity, Mexico and the rest of LATAM are going to be the easiest place to go. But I'm also very bullish on Africa. I've talked to a lot of African entrepreneurs, and if you can handle the time zone difference, which you're dealing with Asia anyway, if you can handle that, that's the next 50 years, right? I see India between now and 2040, 2050. India will be online totally the way China is, and then it's Africa's turn. So depending on how young you are, figure out which language you want to learn, right? Okay, so you got francophone countries in Africa. You've got, I think, Cape Verde. You've got one Spanish-speaking country in Africa. A lot of opportunities. So whatever you're interested in, whether you are in the CEO seat now or you want to be CEO in 20 years, these are the things you want to think about.
And Jonathan, if I can just stay with you for just a second, I'm curious. We get a lot of kind of conflicting reports about how much companies really are trying to divest or decouple from China. What is the general sentiment that you are seeing? Are companies, recognizing that there's enough supply chain or reputational risk, and they've gotten to the point where maybe it's better to not be so deeply tied to China, or are there still some evaluation that they just need to do the minimum needed for regulatory compliance and that there's enough value still there?
I think it depends on what you're in China for. So for companies that are doing manufacturing and don't have China-centric operations, they're not trying to sell to the China market. Every single one of them has been asking since COVID and even trade war, right? Once those tariffs started coming, they started asking the question. Every company in the United States was asking that question, and not just the U.S., because we have a lot of foreign companies with operations in the U.S., and so it impacts the way they can interact with China. So I would say every single U.S. company that I've talked to has a China exit plan, or at least a China contingency plan that they want to act on. Now, whether they can act on it or not, that's really the hard thing. Those companies that are in China for China, they're doubling down on China. If we're going with the laws of supply and demand, as the demand lessens, and because companies are pulling out of China, the government, the companies, factories that have to keep people employed are going to get more desperate. They're going to offer better deals. And if we happen to be first in line ahead of the other developing nations that are going to keep using China as a manufacturing base for now, you can start to write your own ticket. You're renegotiating your contracts. I'd say anytime you can renegotiate your contract in your favor, do it. Right? That's the key. Is you blame it on your lawyer. You blame it on market conditions. You say, you know what, things have changed. We really need to take a look at this. You give them a little bit of anxiety on the other side of the table, and then you can go in and write your prenup exit plan just in case you need to do it, right? And then you can make your contracts enforceable in China if your counterparty is not going to play ball with you.
Can I just add to
Yeah,
that?
please.
So I just say that the EU Chamber did a survey of its membership, and 25% of its members have said that they're looking to shift investment or not put new investment down. But that means 75, to the point, are staying, mostly because they're there for the China market. And then on the prenup, I'm just going to add one more issue on the prenup.
Please do.
So the important thing, I don't call it a prenup, I call it when you do your entry plan, have the exit plan, get the board buy-in, and make sure everyone agrees to those red lines. Because when I was in China, what I saw over and over again is companies would be like, yep, we're going to do this deal. And I'd say, okay, great. And do you have an exit plan? They're like, yep, here's my exit plan. And then inevitably, I'd see them again, and they've been past the exit plan. I'm like, wait a minute, you said you were going to leave. They're like, oh, no, it's just another $200 million. It's fine. It's this special thing. I'm like, So one of the things is get the prenup agreed to by the CEO, by the board, by the people in the company that need to really buy into that up front. That was my only other comment.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. So now, as promised, I want to circle back to broader discussion about decoupling a little bit and ask anyone who has thoughts or wants to jump in here. We talk a lot, or you hear a lot about decoupling between the United States and China, whether that's what China's doing for its own self-reliance, or what the conversations we've just been having about what U.S. companies or other companies are factoring in. What does that look like? What do you think it looks like over the next few years? What are some of the key things that you would say we should be watching for? And do you think that if we are headed for some version, some amount of decoupling, whether that will be driven by who drives that? Is it governments? Is it individual businesses? Who's making kind of the decisions in that process? So who wants to go? Yeah.
I'll take a stab. I mean, for one thing, I think the talk of decoupling. I mean, it oftentimes, I think, is it oftentimes plays out in an environment where people throw out false choices, as if there are the only alternatives are a full-on decoupling, we don't trade with China, cold turkey, or sort of full integration. More kind of like the late 90s, end of history, kind of way of organizing ourselves. There's a lot of ground between those two poles, and I think that's where we're going to end up. I actually think that I think that the federal government needs to be really involved, and I think the most important thing it needs to do is it needs to set a clear policy. It needs to tell companies like mine and others, this is what we want you to do. This is the time frame that you have to do it. These are the incentives, or these are the incentives that we will give you in order to make this happen, or these are the consequences if you don't do it. I think that if as Sarah mentioned, I applaud the Biden administration's supply chain studies. I think they were very informative. But the reality is that this is complicated. But the tools that government has for moving supply chains, I mean, they are few in number, And I think we're just sort of at the time where, the government needs to decide what sectors are important that need to be reshored, where are the reshoring destinations that the government is comfortable with, and what's the timeline, and what are the incentives, and what are the consequences. I really think if those expectations were known and were clear, in terms of what I don't actually think the government would have to do as much as you might think in terms of incentives or punitive consequences. I think companies would fall in line. But what we don't have is that clarity. In fairness, we didn't have it in the last administration either. There's an acknowledgement that supply chains are a problem. And just getting back to the tools, though, I will say that I think everybody agrees that supply chain diversification is something that especially after the COVID experience, is something that we need. But the tools that government has to move supply chains are few, and they're very blunt. They really come down to subsidies, tariffs, and either domestic content requirements or some sort of import restriction. Like, that's it. There aren't other tools. There's no magic beautiful tool that's easily that's easily wielded, that has no costs or consequences. But I think just the sooner we get on with this, the better off we're going to be, because this is going to be a long process. It took a long time for supply chains to migrate as far away from this country as they have. And my own personal view is, rather than wringing our hands about how tough this is going to be, we need to be realistic about, and we're not going to decouple completely. I think that's not a viable option. But I think we just really need. I think we need leadership and clear plans and expectations.
Great. I'll jump on to. I'm going to add on to that. And in that, I do think there are a couple other things that government should be top of mind or looking at. When I look at, and Intel runs around the world looking at where they're going to put a fab, it's pretty complicated. And it's an intensive negotiation with governments around the world. But it's about infrastructure, it's about energy, it's about water, it's about clean water, it's about standards. What type of energy, how clean, how much more do we have to put in as a company to get the clean water we need? It's about trade facilitation, meaning, how long, because time is money, right? How long does it take to clear customs, right? So single windows, governments could implement single windows. That'd be huge, because I want hours. I don't want days, and I certainly don't want weeks to get my stuff out of a country, in and out of countries. And so I do think there is a more broader, yes, those are the tools, but I think there is a broader discussion that governments can facilitate. And certainly we've seen it in Europe, in terms of the incentives, and the incentives are not just money, it's this kind of stuff. And that's really impactful. So I would just put that on the table as another.
I'd put that in the incentives bucket.
Okay.
That's really important.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure, that was my point.
Great. Anything else, Mark?
So if we're continuing on the rail analogy, because we're talking about decoupling the rail cars, right? I'd say that we're going to be operating on parallel tracks, right? We're still going to be largely in sync, right? We're all pushing for development. U.S. China, we're pushing the boundaries of all the technology that we can, and we're going to be looking at each other out of the side of our eyes, just like a couple of sprinters in a race. So I see that as it going. If we're just talking sheer demographic strength of China, the business community, right? I have friends who have been in China for a long time, and they're very smart people, and they're very driven people. And so I don't think that we don't have the corner on innovation. I think that we can continue to vote with our feet to the extent that we as business people want to draw a line in the sand and say, there are some things that I'm just not willing to do business with China on. Others will just have to engage deeper, right? So it's going to depend. I think the other thing, for those of you who are engaged in business with China or thinking about doing business with China, the key that I think about a lot is, where do you fit? And this was mentioned in one of the other panels. Where do you fit in China's national plan, right? Are you important enough? Like, if you had asked me a year ago, before the education bust, the for-profit education bust, if you had asked me if I thought that education could be a problematic business environment to be in China, I would have said, yeah, right? Do you know anything about China? Do you know anything about China's history? Do you know why people's education is important? Do you know where it's headed? Do you know the demographic invert that we're dealing with, right? So there are a lot of things that if understanding more about the geopolitical concerns, about the demographic concerns, about the cultural identity of the Chinese people as a Confucian history, right? There are there are so many components to it, and it's not just China, it's every country has a history, which is what makes this so beautiful and so terrible to tackle at the same time, right? Because there are so many factors that you're dealing with. You just need to know more, right? Make more friends, ask more questions. Don't be afraid to ask dumb questions. This is the way we all get smarter together, and as a business community here in Utah and in the United States, we can navigate China better than we have done in the last 10, 20, 30 years.
Speaking of asking questions, another great segue for me.
No
Thank
dumb
you.
questions, just dumb people. It's fine.
I want to open it up to see if there's anybody in our audience that has any questions for our panel. We have a few minutes left here, so we can take a couple questions. So first, out the gate, I have one here, and then I see you back there, and then here.
First, a quick comment. CJ, would you get Microsoft?
Oh, looks like we have a mic here.
CJ, would you get Microsoft to quit changing Office 365 so often, because digital dinosaurs like me have a hell of a time.
Hey, we're
Get
just,
right
we're,
on
just, we're
that.
just constantly improving the product. so
Yeah,
that's,
right. And Jonathan, in Utah County, there are several companies that are working on instantaneous translators. So I was in China in the Himalayas and used my iPhone to have a conversation. Admittedly, it was slow. How quickly do you think that kind of communication, I mean, I'm a language impaired individual, even with English. But tell me, when do you think we would have the ability to communicate without having to learn the language?
I think we're there, right? I mean, I think with the technology we have now, like you said, we can have discussions across languages with our apps, and it's pretty good. I mean, it's okay. It doesn't get you the cultural nuances. It doesn't get you the the inflections. It doesn't give you you can still read body language. So I think that's valuable, and it's certainly better than just emailing, right? So to the extent that we can do it, I think that having those person-to-person interactions are going to be key if we're looking at the 50-year plan on us with China. Going to the weddings, inviting them here, having those exchanges and changing those hearts one at a time. I would say that especially with the Chinese people and with others that have learned English all their lives and kind of feel like we have a chip on our shoulder because we got lucky with the global language. I think it goes a long way. I found that in Mexico a month ago, even though my Spanish was garbage. You can get deeper in a relationship if you show that you are taking that step toward them rather than just waiting for them to come to you. Even if you're language impaired, it's okay.
Great. All right, Mary? Yeah, I think I can talk loud enough. I think for the online audience, they would, can you just throw it?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for a really interesting discussion on moving supply chains. I found it very enlightening. I have two quick questions. One has to do with small and medium enterprises, or small and medium companies, as we say here in the U.S. As you talk about companies finding new sources, new places to produce, doesn't that sort of advantage the larger companies who can pay the fixed costs of moving, as opposed to the medium-sized manufacturers, in the Midwest and other places that have set up relationships with Chinese suppliers and now find they have to change those? So that's my question. The second question is just about processing trade. You're also describing the fact, and Jonathan was very articulate about this, and maybe others before I came in, about how we're seeing this division between those who are manufacturing in China to ship out of China versus those who are in China to sell to China. And U.S. companies, I have to say, are largely in China to sell to China, if we look at the BEA data. But won't the Chinese have, it seems to me, removed a lot of the preferences for processing trade over time, including how they handle the rebates of tariff revenues, et cetera. What do you see in that space? And couldn't China react and say, oh, we're losing this, we're going to change our policies again to keep more of it? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Great. All right. Who wants to take a first stab?
Sure. Yeah, I was just taking notes. Great questions and really interesting BA data. I was thinking when you're talking about a lot of the analysis I do now with companies that are looking to China, and I'm kind of a little bit shocked at companies that that every time I take a call and they're saying, we're going into China, we have a partner in China. I say, have you been in China before? They say, no. I'm like, so you're even, despite, maybe they haven't been following the news, right? Despite COVID, despite Xi on the golden throne for the next 50 years, right? They say, we're going to go to China. I said, all right, fine, let's go to China. So I get a little bit, it's funny, but what we end up doing is the analysis on how, if you're engaging with China, are you going full board, right? Are you going in to form an entity on the ground? Are you acquiring assets? Or are you looking for a JV partner? Or are you looking for a partner to be your sales rep? Or are you going to do e-commerce, because you can still deploy your business model via e-commerce, which is very robust in China, by the way. So the idea of retooling, why we're in China, right? I think that there are ways to be in China in a fairly deep way without having set a toe in China. And that's really what I've been advising clients to do for the last couple of years is let's wait and see. If you don't have to have your business model on the ground in China, then let's take your product, service, whatever you're doing in the United States, and let's find good partners who you trust. Let's make the contracts very tight, and let's make sure the money flows first to you and then back into China to pay your partners.
I would just say, Mary, you're absolutely right. It does favor the large companies, and the large companies are in China for China. Only 2% of the AmJam members are actually in China to export anywhere else. So it is about market access, right, which is a thorn in USTR's side of how do you get a level playing field of market access? That is the holy grail, right? How do we do that? But you're absolutely right. It is tough for SMEs to the sunk costs, the operational costs to switch out. But again, I think when you looked at the data from the EU chamber, I think what they're talking about, to the point, is it's not an all or nothing. It's a bit of a pivot. And if you look at the numbers, I would say that Vietnam's exports are up, right? I think Vietnam is gaining a little bit. I think Vietnam, though, gained when the TPP was being negotiated. There was that first huge rush to let's go to Vietnam. The other thing is just a rising tide rises all boats, right? When I look at the semiconductor field, there is going to need to be not only producing the chip, you got to test the chip, you got to package the chip, you got to put it on substrates. It's an ecosystem. Currently, the ecosystem is divided around the world in various places. I have a design center in Guadalajara. I have testing in Costa Rica. I have Israel, which has everything, right? It is a bit of a mishmash already. But I think it's going to be, to your point, it's not an all or nothing. It's a shift.
So I promised to get to one more question here, and we're almost out of time. So we're going to try to do a quick round, and maybe you can, if you had another response, CJ, you can wrap it up here. So we'll take one more question here.
Thank you. Given the fact that we have Xi in China who can pivot at his will, we have a government in the U.S. is subject to being voted out within the next 4 years, always. And then we have, in the rest of the world, we still have other problems where we've got either corruption or we've got tribal feuds. How does one, from any one of those countries, look at these confusions, if you will, these instabilities of tradition or politics? How do they make a plan and know that they can actually last?
Easy question to conclude on.
I guess I would be a little bit more. I mean, I don't don't dispute the trends that you highlight. I guess I'm perhaps naively a little more optimistic, in that I do think on this on the issue of this particular issue of supply chain diversification. I think that is a place where there is bipartisan consensus. I mean, although the USICA Act seems a little bogged down right now, I mean, ultimately we will see the CHIPS Act passed. I think we will see stronger incentives for supply chain diversification on some issues like that. I think that there's kind of a dissonance between the relative degree of consensus on some of those issues, and then just the complete histrionic division on other issues. The other thing I would just say, and as somebody who was very involved in the USMCA negotiations, is that I would start with, I would start with our region and with, I think that, to Jonathan's points, I think Mexico is, I think if there's any country in the world that the United States has a stake in, it is Mexico, because it is, we share, not only, history, culture, and border, but it is in the interest of the United States to have a strong and prosperous Mexico. When I was at USTR, we always said that if, factories are going to come to the United States, Mexico is the second best outcome for us, because if a factory is in Mexico, that means that, first of all, Mexicans have, stable employment, good paying jobs, and there are ancillary benefits to the United States from that, but it also means that, we're going to, more of the parts and materials from that factory consumes will be sourced from the United States. So I would, I think it's a complicated world. I would start at, I'd start at home, and then try to, build out regionally, and hope that we can build a, stronger, more prosperous, more, resilient region, and hopefully that at least, buffers us from some of these trends, which are real and troubling.
Great. Any closing thoughts from either Sarah or Jonathan?
So one example to go off of this, in Mexico they have the maquiladora manufacturing model, which is basically, we'll give you the shell, we'll give you the power. You come in and build your factory inside our shell, and that's not what we're used to in the U.S. for the most part, unless you're a medical device company or you're an Intel, right? So I think that there has to be some flexibility, right? The companies, U.S. companies who think, well, we're only good at this much, probably need to retool a little bit, right? And that's scary, I know. But to the extent that you need to enter into creative JVs, we're creating business groups around this common problem of supply chain retooling. We're greater together as we pool those resources. And so I see those kind of groups growing, and to the extent they exist, broadening their aspect. And I think we see some creative things happening in the U.S. I think that we always get better when we get backed into a corner. And so I feel like if you don't feel like you're backed into a corner yet, just keep reading the news, and then we'll all go to work together. I'm pretty optimistic about that.
I'm going to put one more thing on the table before we leave, just because, why not? One thing we haven't talked about is talent and the talent war, and the skill set. Hugely important. Intel part of my team, their entire job is to run around the world and to help do trainings, not of Intel, but of an ecosystem. AI for youth, STEM for women, trying to develop the next generation of skilled employees, because that's the one thing none of us have talked about, right, but is hugely important. It's the human capital aspect of all of these equations. And I would argue that Mexico is fairly attractive in that. But you were gonna. And
Mexico also has a deficit, by the way, so they need to pull from the rest of LATAM. So we have to keep to keep pulling them in. But you're exactly right.
And China needs 10 million university jobs every single year, just for the university graduates, as Mary talked about earlier, right? It's the DDD that was discussed on her panel. So that's when I think about some of these markets, that's top of mind for me. Is what does the demographics look like? Is it aging? Is it a young population? Is it trained? What am I working with?
And immigration policy.
And that's the other policy thing we could really do, is change our immigration policy.
I agree. That is more, obviously, I completely agree, and I think it's one of our competitive advantages is the fact that smart, ambitious, industrious people want to come to the United States.
Work here.
But I think, and unfortunately, our politics on that issue, I'm not optimistic about in the short run. But I do think on the broader skilling issue, that is one where I could see a big cyber skilling, bipartisan bill that could be put together at some point. We have, in cybersecurity, which is, it's something that Microsoft, focuses on quite a bit. We have an amazing deficit in the people that we need, and those are good, solid middle class jobs that now with especially with remote work, those are jobs that don't have to be in Seattle and Silicon Valley. They can be in different parts of the country.
Yep. Anyway, I don't mean to put that on and then rush out the door, but I guess we are, right?
Bye.
We are, but I think it's a good food for thought. Leave folks with a little something to think about. So let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much.